first question is, if I just take a step back and we go with a scenario in which the ANC needs a coalition partner in order to get a majority. Just put me in the shoes of the members of the ANC that are brokering that coalition and give us an understanding of what their priorities are going to be in terms of extracting the best coalition for the ANC. So what does success look like for them? I mean, are they looking for, positions in government? Is it legislative support? Is it access to resources?
Yeah. Look, the horrible thing that happened inside the ANC is that its internal ranks have been deeply corrupted to a point where the short-term ambitions and fears, often going to prison, of senior ANC leaders override the good sense that's needed to save the party. And in some work done many years ago, already, it was suggested that a point had been reached where a majority of the executive committee members of the ANC, which is essentially the board, could be implicated in corruption to a point that they might be sent to prison. And because there's such a group within that party, and because the more centrist leadership of the party doesn't have the courage to hound it out and send it to prison, ultimately, through the courts, the ANC is stuck in this quagmire where there's a perfect understanding, I assure you, of the risk of a loss of defeat, and a quite clear understanding of the reasons for that material circumstances of people drive things. You do not need in ANC circles to explain the problem. It is better understood there than often outside of the party. But because there is a fear of what the consequences would be if the country became fundamentally free and open place, many of these individuals might then be pursued and prosecuted. The prospect of the ANC breaking towards reform is very limited. And it's partly for that reason that I think the prospect of the DA-ANC coalition is one worth entertaining. Because for the ANC's, whatever remains of its leadership, to break towards that deal, implicit in that, would be that the less desirable elements of the party have been surrendered and have been left behind. But why it was always futile, there was a lot of confidence around Mr. Ramaphosa and the group and the team I worked with at the time had grave doubts about that, was because we understood that one of his priorities would be to unite the ANC. And that was a strategic miscalculation, because in uniting it, they would cut off any avenues to the reforms necessary to restore the confidence of the supporters necessary to secure the majority. The consequences of that are what we see in the data today.
So in other words, you needed to have actually a purge of the party in order to have any reform of some of its members.
Yeah, the only way that it might have saved itself would have been to have a very brutal internal conflict, which would have left let's call it the reform element of the ANC, likely with a political, without a majority. And its only likely then avenue back to power would be a deal with the centrist DA. And I think the prospect of that was so difficult and daunting that the strategy that was in fact pursued was, let's see if we can unite this. But what you were uniting is you were uniting a decent people and reform-minded thinkers with dangerous and powerful crooks. And the net result of that is this kind of atrophication and stagnation, which describes, the feelings of a lot of people, observers, and in fact the policy behavior of the ANC over the past 5 or 6 years.
Yeah. I mean, just further to that, I saw in your kind of probabilities that you actually put, if the ANC does need a partner to get them to a majority, that if you add up those probabilities, you put 75% probability on them doing a deal with the EFF rather than the DA. And I mean, to your point, is that really the reason? And is it because the DA will be a lot more demanding in terms of what they would demand from a coalition arrangement?
Yeah, look, what the motivation for the EFF deal would be is maybe we can strike something that protects powerful individuals from the future prospects of prosecution, which is a very frightening prospect if you put yourself in the position of that person. You're now putting in place a chain of events that might end up with you going to jail because you've done whatever you've done. There's a second view inside the ANC, which is the more sophisticated view. And that says, if we do this EFF deal, we're going to take our brand, which I showed you, which is dishonesty and betrayal, and we're going to mesh it with the EFF brand, which is violence and anarchy. And we're going to do that in a centrist country where our last kind of redoubt of support is an aging rural demographic that will be eroded at the mortality rate. And what we're going to simply do as a consequence is accelerate what you saw in the urban voting data, this flood of voter opinion away from the ANC into the centrist opposition. And I think that's correct. And where that ends is with the ANC becoming then a regionally based rural party in northwestern Mpumalanga and Limpopo, where it will fight it out to the death, sometimes literally, with elements of the EFF, while more urban South Africa and the East Coast and so on picks itself up, and down here in the Cape picks itself up and begins the reform process. So for more centrist ANC thinkers, and there's some heroic people left inside the ANC under terrible circumstances, desperately disappointed and trying their best. For them, and I think they're right on the strategy, is that the EFF deal is a dead end for us. The only way we don't lose power if we make the EFF deal is by destroying the democratic infrastructure of the country so that we don't have to face another election. Because if we do, we will surely lose, and they're right. Now, a client might take me to the point of saying, well, if they make the deal, they're definitely going to destroy the democracy. It's all over, and we should just sort of flee to the wilds of Canada and the Australian outback. It's not that easy to do. To become a fascist, autocratic dictatorship, you firstly need a very efficient civil service and strongly motivated, ideologically motivated, radicalized security infrastructure. We don't have either of those. So your occasional frustrations at the incompetent civil service has a flip side that saves you from the risk of that. Secondly, any attempt to actually get us to a point where we really won't have another election means you first got to print a lot of money to create inflation and populism and harness that to your autocratic scheme. You then need to stamp out the independent media so that the articulation of ideas in society can no longer occur. You then actually need to cheat in that election to a point that completely overrides the ability to expose it and see it. It is very difficult to do, even if you had that civil service. So my sense is that an attempt, let's say you do put the ANC and the EFF together and they do attempt to do this, the likelihood is that they will fail. And that in their failure, we'll go through a rough few years, but in their failure, what they will in fact begin to do is to bring a much stronger centrist coalition government to power. Now this stuff is very difficult to think through because we're exposed to a lot of mainstream stuff and we live in the country, many of us, we're invested in the country and it's hard to get away from the fear and the hope and so on. But on the cold, clinical, thinking it through step by step, balance of probabilities is the attempts to destroy the society, if we're now at that point, will in fact deliver an accelerated reform government. And that's just that's just where the data and the lessons of history and the hard facts are taking us. And I'm accused sometimes of being optimistic, and which is different territory to the first 10 years of my career, where I spent a lot of time warning that we could get into trouble, using the very same methodology that you see here this morning. But I think that if you get out of the noise and you think through it, at the very least, you will have to entertain the prospect that a reform horizon of what remains a still free society, attempting an economic recovery, is a prospect now that must be taken very seriously. I think that's perhaps the most qualified way to put it.